Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.
The interview series Reflections in Time was begun by the late Professor Paul Borghi more than 20 years ago. This new series continues Paul's work and is dedicated to his memory. This is how Paul began many of the 73 interviews that he recorded. It's often exciting to look at the future of UNO, what it might be like in times to come. Sometimes, though, it's important to stop and take a look at the past of the university, the people, and the happenings that helped make the excitement of future history possible. With this in mind, join me for Reflections in Time. My name is Jack Newton. I'm retired now, but I'm still active as a professor emeritus. I've been on the faculty of UN Omaha since 1960 and served for 20 years as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. I worked closely with Professor Borghi in the development of his original interview series, and I can think of no more fitting tribute to him than to continue this work. It's a bright and chilly morning in early November of the year 2000, and I have as my guest here this morning Dr. John Flocken. Dr. Flocken is a longtime professor of physics here at UNO, and currently he's serving as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, which is my old job. So, John, you're kind of a replacement for me, I guess.
That's right.
You've been here for quite a while, as I mentioned. You've served in all faculty ranks from assistant professor through professor, and beginning back when?
1969 is when I came, right?
Yeah, that is quite a while.
It is, 31 years.
You know, I know a lot about you, John, obviously, because as I said, you've taken over my old job, but I don't think we've ever stopped and talked about what your roots are. Where do you come from?
Okay, well, I was born and raised in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is not very far from here. Went to Washington High School there and graduated in '57, and then I went to college my first year at South Dakota State in Brookings. Got a fellowship there. Started out actually majoring in chemistry rather than physics because in high school, I guess I had found chemistry a little bit more intriguing than physics.
That's what I started in. I started to be a chemist too. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
It was years ago.
Yeah, actually I got a job washing bottles and so on in the storeroom to help put myself through because I came from kind of a poor background, so I kind of had to rely on fellowships and scholarships and so on to get through. And in fact, the reason I didn't go back to Brookings for my sophomore year was that I had scholarships and fellowships, but not enough to pay my way, so I decided to live at home in Sioux Falls and go to Augustana College. Mm-hmm. And so I went to Augustana and graduated from there in '61 with a major in physics and math both.
Now, how did you switch over to physics from chemistry?
Physics was sort of initially my second choice, but I guess I think the thing that got me turned off as far as chemistry was concerned was that most of the chemists seemed to be organic chemists, and I wasn't that interested in organic chemistry.
Well, at least you didn't have an explosion in the laboratory or something.
Fortunately not, no. They managed to keep a pretty good eye on me, I think, and they didn't let me do anything too dangerous.
So you graduated from Augustana back in 1961.
Right.
And then what?
Then I had a fellowship for my first year of graduate school to Florida State University. They were trying to build up their physics program down there, and they had gotten a bunch of what were called nuclear science fellowships from the legislature. And I was lucky enough to be awarded one of those, and at the time I thought nuclear science sounded like a pretty good thing. I think that was kind of a buzzword in that time period anyway. So I went to Florida State for my first year, And frankly, the competition there was really pretty stiff, and I was not as well prepared as I should have been. So that plus I really needed to be closer to home for some personal reasons. So I went to UNL, and
University of Nebraska,
University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and stayed there and got my master's degree in 1964 in physics.
Still in physics.
Still in physics, right. And then I went out and worked for a little while.
I noticed that in the resume that you gave me earlier, that you had a couple of years of work. Now, were you still a graduate student while you were doing that, or did you just work full-time?
No, I just worked full-time. When I had attended Augustana during the summers, I had worked for an outfit in Sioux Falls called Raven Industries. Raven Industries is kind of an interesting institution or industry, I guess I should say. It's still there, yeah. It was formed by a group of people who had worked for General Mills in Minneapolis, and they were in a division of General Mills that made high-altitude balloons, helium balloons, and flew scientific missions, cosmic ray detectors and that kind of thing. But the people at Raven wanted to do some more diverse kinds of things, and so they got into all kinds of intriguing sort of inflatable devices, parachutes, drag devices, and so on. Hot air balloons. I think hot air balloons really was a thing that made them in the 60s and 70s, because that became kind of a popular sport, so they made a lot of money.
Working in that field. Did you get a chance to go up in the air a little bit?
I did.
Was that fun?
It was. I had a lot more experience, however, chasing unmanned balloons. We used to set them loose and let them go, and we'd track them. We had an airplane that would track them and also a truck, and I was usually in the truck. So when the thing came down in somebody's cornfield, we'd get permission to go out and gather it up, and we'd have all sorts of data. The interesting thing about working at Raven, though, was that I was the only person there that didn't have an engineering degree. I had a physics degree, and so my math background was a lot stronger than theirs. And so anything that required a lot of really extensive mathematical, computational kinds of things, I got to do that. So I was kind of in on all the projects.
Well, maybe some of our audience can take that as a lesson. If your people are students or prospective college students, math background's a good thing.
That's right, it is, very much so, especially if you want to get into it.
I have a son who had a math major, and he went on to computer science, and he said he was way ahead of all his contemporaries because he had the math background that they didn't have.
Right, absolutely important. Yeah, speaking of computers, was working at Raven where I first learned Fortran.
That was a long time ago.
And there were no classes back then, so you were pretty much on your own. So I kind of taught myself out of manuals.
Fortran 2 probably, right?
Yep. Yeah.
I remember learning that too. And then it seems to me, I recall that you worked for another company as well.
Yeah, I kind of felt that I was kind of stilted a little bit at Raven, and there were some other opportunities available, so I got a job working at Bendix Research Laboratories in Southfield, Michigan. And that was kind of an interesting job too. They were working on basically the beginning of night vision kinds of goggles. And so there was a process in which a person had to take glass and put metal implants in the glass and then form it into tubes and draw these tubes down into very small diameter tubes and put them in clusters. And then when you sliced those clusters apart, you got little wafers that served as the eyepieces for the goggles. And since they had metal in the glass, if you put electrodes on the two ends of the wafers and put a voltage across it, any light that came in on one side would start a cascade of electrons down these tubes and then come out and strike a phosphorescent tube on the other end. So you could actually see in very low intensity rooms that were virtually totally black. Without these things, you could see with them.
Was this experience that you had working in industrial firms, did this serve you well later on when you went on to become a college professor? Did you find it valuable to have that kind of experience?
Sure, yeah. I think it's important, particularly in the area that I wound up in, to be a little bit pragmatic about things and to understand what it is you can do and what you can't do, and what sort of things what kind of data you actually need, and so on. So it was very useful in that respect. I can't say that I strained my knowledge of physics in one of those jobs, but certainly I picked up a lot of practical
But you
things.
did go back to graduate school.
I went back to graduate school.
How did you make that decision?
Well, in working at Bendix, they did have some people there who were actually doing the basic research on which these multiplier arrays were based, and I decided that that's really what I wanted to do, and I realized I couldn't do that without a PhD. And so my wife at that time had a family back in Nebraska, so I decided to apply back to UNL, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I went back there and started my doctoral work there. And I was very fortunate that I came back to UNL just at a time when the man who was to become my dissertation advisor, John Hardy, had immigrated to the United States from Bristol, England, where he had been part of their equivalent to the Atomic Energy Commission. But he was in solid-state physics, solid-state theory. And I took a couple of courses from him and decided that that was what I really wanted to do. And so he was gracious enough to take me on as a graduate student, and I did my dissertation in theoretical solid-state physics.
I noticed, too, from the resume that you gave me that you had a number of summer appointments where you worked, and I think it was out in California,
Right.
wasn't it? At
Lawrence Livermore Laboratories.
What was that?
That was actually a laboratory that was run by the University of California, Berkeley, for the government, for what was then the Atomic Energy Commission. And Lawrence Livermore Laboratories and Berkeley, or rather Los Alamos, were the two primary weapons laboratories at that time. They since evolved into other things. Lawrence Livermore is more of a generalized kind of energy laboratory. Now they work on magnetic fusion and things like that, all kinds of potential energy sources.
How did you get involved with them?
Well, that was again due to John Hardy, my my dissertation advisor. Even when he was working in England, he had collaborative efforts going on with somebody at Lawrence Livermore named Arnold Caro. They wrote a lot of papers together and book chapters, and in fact that was one of the primary reasons that John decided to come to the United States, was so that he could be closer to working with Arnold. And since Arnold was sort of the chief of one of the departments in the chemical division out there, I was able to go out with John Hardy and do my work out there, which was really fantastic.
I noticed you worked there for a number of summers.
I did. I worked there for a number of summers, and even during the year I had some consultative contracts with them, so I would fly out occasionally during the school year as well.
Now, when you first started working for them, that must have been in the late 60s.
It was
kind of a time of turbulence, especially out in the Berkeley area.
Yes,
did you get involved in any of that stuff?
Not directly, but I saw a lot of it. I had occasion, actually.
I wouldn't imagine that working for an Atomic Energy Commission research laboratory that you would have been out protesting or anything.
No, I was not not in that group at all. But I did actually get a couple of opportunities to go to the Berkeley campus, and certainly it was a time when you saw a lot of hippies around and flower children and so on in the parks and so on.
That was a kind of a different era, wasn't it?
It was very different, yeah, very different.
So you did see a few of the turbulent times of that era.
Yeah, fortunately the only riots I saw were on television, so I'm kind of grateful for that.
But you did graduate with a PhD then from University of Nebraska.
Lincoln.
And how did you come to Omaha?
Well, it's kind of an interesting story. I almost came here by default, really. Among the other contacts that John Hardy had was a very strong contact with people at the Naval Research Laboratory in Virginia, close to Washington, D.C. And they had it sort of pretty much set up for me to have a postdoc there. And so I was not really out looking for jobs very actively. But the situation was that each of the divisions at the Naval Research Laboratory had a certain number of postdocs that they could award every year. And usually they had maybe 10 applicants for every postdoc. And the postdocs were ultimately chosen by the department chairs. And John Hardy knew one of these department chairs very well, Dick Wallace. But 1969 was an interesting time for another reason. That's because that's when the crunch hit in the job market in physics. Yes. And so what happened was that that year, when I was supposed to go to NRL, instead of having 10 applicants per every opening, they had about 100. And they didn't let the division chiefs select the postdocs. Those were selected by the administrators at the Office of Naval Research.
So instead of a postdoctoral fellowship at the Navy Research Laboratory, you ended up...
I came to UNO. Yeah, it just happened that Don Schultz, who was teaching in the physics department here at the time, was also working on his PhD at UNO. And so he said, well, we're hiring at UNO, why don't you come up and look around? So I came up and interviewed, and I got the job. And I've been here ever since. I've been treated very well, and I've enjoyed it.
I'm sure that's been to the great benefit of the university, too. Well, tell me about your first impressions of the campus when you arrived here for your job interview. Had you ever been on the campus here before?
No, I hadn't. I was favorably impressed. You know, we were housed in the engineering building initially on the first floor, and I was impressed with the rest of the faculty and the work that they were doing. There was another faculty member who was hired at the same time as I was, and that was Ray Gunther. And in fact, we were the first two faculty members on the physics faculty that had PhDs. But I really liked the setup, and I liked the people. And of course, I knew Don Schultz pretty well. He and I were pretty good friends.
Well, the department was pretty small back then.
It was about six
but obviously
people.
Growing, because they were hiring some new people.
That's right. Yeah, I think maybe I was a replacement for somebody who had left, somebody named Jim Ederer, but Ray Gunther's line, I think, was a new one. And we since hired a couple more, so we grew from, I think, about 7 in '69 to 10 now.
Wow.
So we have had the opportunity over the years to add faculty.
Did you notice any differences between your experiences at UNO and your experience at other universities, like, you know, well, you attended several, but Augustana, UNL?
UNO seemed to me to be a lot like Augustana, except that the faculty was a little bigger. And of course, that was a time period right after the campus joined the system, and enrollment was growing like crazy, which is why they were hiring a lot of additional people.
Yeah,
so
when
we
really became a state university, I think that first year we went up by 25, 28%, something like that.
I think
in
so.
Enrollment.
It was huge, right? So in a way, it was a very similar kind of program to what I had experienced at Augustana, but it was larger, and we started getting more physics majors, which made it a lot more interesting. They had a very strong program here in terms of curriculum, and I think because of the fact that we didn't have a master's program or any kind of a graduate program, we tended to make our undergraduate program stronger and make our undergraduates work a little harder, try to work in some of the things that they might normally get as first-year graduate students.
Well, what was the curriculum like back then?
Well, I think physics curriculum, I think their curricula are pretty similar across the country. There are certain core courses that you expect everybody to have, theoretical mechanics, thermodynamics, optics, a couple of semesters of electricity and magnetism, modern physics course. And we had all of those, plus some smatterings of other things. We had some astronomy courses. We had a molecular solid-state physics course, nuclear physics. We had a course in relativity. So it was a pretty strong curriculum, as I said. And actually, later on, we added to it. We added a course in mathematical physics. One of the problems that is experienced, I think, by physics departments everywhere is that if a student comes in wanting to major in physics and they don't have very much of a math background from high school, they have to take algebra and then 3 semesters of calculus, so they're ready to take junior and senior level physics courses without enough math. So we added a mathematical physics course to strengthen that area. And later on we ended up actually streamlining things a little bit, since we found that we were not getting as many people enrolled in some of our upper level courses. We combined, for example, nuclear physics and relativity together into one course, and made a couple of other combinations like that to sort of streamline it. So I think it's still a very strong curriculum, but it's frugal. Most of our courses we only offer every other year, except for the theoretical, except for the mathematical physics course and the modern physics course. So,
well, I want to start talking about your administrative work here at the university, but before we do that, since we're on the topic here of what you were doing in the physics department, what sort of courses were you teaching?
Primarily, I taught thermodynamics. I taught the mathematical physics course and theoretical mechanics course, and the solid state course whenever it was offered.
Did you ever get involved in any of those big freshman sections, or was that somebody else's job?
Everybody taught some of the general education courses as well. Primarily, what I taught were calculus level physics sections, which were required for the engineers and other sciences.
One of the things that stands out in your record, if I remember correctly, is that you've continued to do research. And that must have been a little different when you first came here, because back in 1969 there weren't a lot of people on the campus doing research.
That's right, yeah. It was hectic, and I was teaching a 12-hour load, and so any research that I did was pretty much on the side.
When we talk about, this is the way college professors measure their workload, right? When you say 12 hours, you don't mean you're only working 12 hours a week.
No,
that means you were
teaching basically 4 class preparations a semester. Actually, not quite that many, because some of the things I was teaching were 4-hour courses as opposed to 3-hour courses. But basically, it was a full, what would be considered today a full teaching load.
Yes. And doing research too. And in an undergraduate department, isn't that a little unusual to be able to continue research in a department where you don't have graduate students working with you?
It is, and I think the only reason I was able to do it is because I was in close proximity to my dissertation advisor, John Hardy, with whom I continued to collaborate. And so we worked together rather than having to work all by myself. It was also a little challenging because the computers that we had at UNO at that time were not really sufficient to do the kind of number crunching that I needed to do for my research. And so I had to use computers at UNL, but also that was another way in which the connection with Livermore Laboratories was useful, because I got to go out and use their computers periodically as well. And eventually we got to the point where, of course, we could transmit codes back and forth very easily from one place to another, so it wasn't so important to have a computer physically located where you were.
Well, as long as we're on the topic of your research, can you, I know that you did a lot of different things, but could you give us some idea of the sort of work you were doing in terms that I can understand?
Sure. Well, I hope so. Well, the work that I did for my doctoral dissertation had to do with atomic defects in different kinds of metals, primarily copper, aluminum, iron, and so on. And when I talk about atomic defects, I'm not talking about the things that you might imagine, like cracks and warps and so on, which are sort of macroscopic kinds of things. But when any of these materials are formed, they form in regular periodic patterns. I think probably everybody has seen a picture in a science book somewhere of a salt crystal where you have sodium chlorine, sodium chlorine, sodium chlorine, and so on. Well, in metals it's the same way. You have these kind of cubic structures, except that in some metals you also have an atom at the center of the cube, or maybe atoms at the faces of the cube sides. And what we mean by defects is when an atom ends up someplace where it isn't supposed to be. For example, if there's an atom at the center of a cube when there isn't supposed to be one, or when there's an atom that is supposed to be at, say, a cube corner, but there isn't one there. These are defects, and they change the properties of the crystal, as you might imagine. If you don't have an atom where one is supposed to be, the other atoms surrounding it tend to migrate inward, and so on. And so all of these have an effect on the mechanical properties of the crystal. And that was basically what we were trying to study, was to see how extensive these mechanical effects would be, and what sort of energy differences there would be between a crystal with a defect and one without.
Sounds like kind of fascinating stuff.
It is, very interesting. And then the research that I did actually when I got out of administration is a little bit different. What I'm continuing to do now is a study of materials that are called ferroelectric or ferroelastic materials. And in a way, it's still dealing with defects, but on a more massive scale. I guess the easiest way to talk about what I do is in terms of phase transitions. People know that, for example, when you melt ice, it turns into water. That's a phase transition. When you boil water, it turns into steam. But a lot of people don't realize that solid objects, solid materials, can also undergo phase transitions and still remain solid. And they do that by having atoms simply move off center from where they're supposed to be. And some of these transitions, most of these transitions, will take place as you lower the temperature of the material. So the kinds of codes that we have right now are ones that allow us to specify some material that we want to study in terms of what kinds of atoms are in it, where they're located, and then we can simulate changes in temperature by simply removing energy from the system or raising it.
Well, I can see where, you know, if you had a student interested in physics, that this would be a way to really stimulate their interest.
Yeah, it really is. It's probably a little easier to talk about with a blackboard or some overheads, but it's really not that much of a difficult thing conceptually.
Well, you certainly had many accomplishments in the field, aside from a long list of published research articles. I noticed that you've been honored with a couple of endowed chairs at the university. You were Isaacson Professor here, and also held the Milo Bale Chair of Physics. And for the benefit of our audience, these named professorships involve endowments of money, and you get a little extra stipend added to your salary, which is always kind of nice to have.
Yep, absolutely.
And but the most important thing is the honor you get by being designated as the recipient of these honors.
Right.
And you also received another honor here, someplace. Trying to find it here. Maybe you can help me out.
It's an Outstanding Research Award for 1990.
Yes.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, that one was particularly gratifying because the competition for those things, as you know, is pretty stiff and has gotten stiffer over the years. As you said, when I first came, there were not a lot of people doing research, but there certainly are now. and very good ones too.
Well, I've certainly held you up as a model for other faculty members to emulate when we talk about research activities. Well, let's talk a little bit about what you did in the administrative field, because you've had a lot of jobs in that area here at the university. Right. We've mentioned, I think, maybe earlier, department chairman, and you held a couple of times when you were department chairman, back in 1976 to 78, I think, was your first stint there. And that goes back a ways.
Actually,
and I remember even before that, I gave you an administrative job, didn't I?
Yes, you did, yes.
Back in 1975, you were Assistant Dean of Arts and Sciences.
I was. That's right. Yeah, that was my first taste of administration.
Back in those days, I was starting out as dean, and one of the things I thought would be a good idea, and I still think it was a good idea, was to bring people in for one-year terms as assistant deans, so that they get a feeling of what the dean's office is like, and so they could help me out, frankly.
Right.
I had a lot of work to do in that office.
That was fun. That was a fun job. I really enjoyed it.
Did that stimulate your interest in becoming a dean someday?
Yeah, well, I think it sort of did. I think the main thing that it did for me was to give me a taste of administration and to find out that I actually enjoyed doing it. I think part of what I really enjoyed most about that position is that it was kind of an unconventional assistant dean position in that I was doing special projects as opposed to a daily routine of things, being responsible for, say, a budget or something like that.
Right.
And I really enjoyed that. I remember one of the things we got going was the New Start program for people who were coming back to the university.
Yeah, we did a number of innovative things. We had, I think maybe the year before, we had, I can't remember now the dates, but that's a long time ago, but we had, I remember two of the programs. One was called Early Entry, and this was for high school students to give them a little taste of college early. And then we had New Start, which you just mentioned, which was for the people who had been out of school for a long time. Back in those days, it was primarily women who had raised a family and decided that they never finished college and they'd like to come back and finish. And so New Start is where we help those folks out.
That's right, yeah. And another thing I remember is the day when you and I went to Jim Maynard and learned how to start doing computer programming to retrieve student records.
That's right. That was one of the early efforts at working with student records in the
computer area. That's right, yeah. Stone Age version of SIS, I guess.
And we're using acronyms here that probably our audience don't know or care about,
system.
But they're all involved in the university's computer system. And then you were department chair the next year, 76 to 78.
Right.
What were the challenges of that job?
Well, it was kind of interesting. When I came to UNO, the history of UNO had been, I guess, autocratic is the way to put it. Milo Bale had been a fairly firm administrator. There was not a lot of faculty governance per se, and so when I came to the physics department here, John McMillan was actually the head of the physics department rather than the chair. The difference being that he wasn't obligated to really,
didn't have to ask your opinion.
Didn't have to ask our opinions on things. So in a way, I was sort of the first chair of the physics department because I took over when he retired. And
so it was more democratic then.
It was more democratic. One of the first things that we did were to set up some departmental policies and procedures such we had never had before. So that was kind of an exciting time, and of course I had to learn the policies and procedures of the campus and the system and so on. I had never really had any of that experience before, never had any real experience with budgeting and finding out how the budget worked and when the deadlines would come around and that sort of thing. So it was kind of an uphill climb, but it was a fun time. It was an exciting time.
And then after that, after your first stint as department chair, you had another job. You were acting dean for graduate studies and research for a couple of years.
Yeah, that's right.
What's that job?
Well, the way that happened was that the person whom we had hired to be the dean for graduate studies and research, Bob Woody, decided that he wanted to go to law school, and he couldn't go to law school and be dean of graduate studies and research. And so I had actually, it was just in my first year of department chair, and John Kerrigan, I guess, who was acting vice chancellor at that time, came and asked me if I would take over the job of dean of the graduate college for 8 months while Bob went to law school. So I did that, and the graduate college basically is the college that oversees all the graduate programs, master's level and doctoral level programs. Doesn't have its own faculty because the same faculty that teach the undergraduate courses also teach the graduate courses. So the dean is in a kind of an awkward situation in sort of having to rely and work very strongly with the deans of the other colleges in order to make things work and make sure that resources are going into the graduate area that should be going into the graduate area and so on. And also you don't have much control over the budget. There's a small budget that you can use for various things, graduate assistantships and various stipends and fellowships and so on.
Anything you remember especially about those years?
Well, I remember that the graduate college office was not as organized as I had thought it would be. And so I ended up having to do a number of things. One of the things that I got a really good response about from the faculty was to put out a newsletter called the Graduate Update, pretty much telling what was going on in the graduate office and highlighting some of the graduate programs and just sort of disseminating some information. Another thing that I did while I was in that job was to make use of some of the things that we had learned about accessing student records from the computer, because in those days a lot of the things that advisors of graduate students were complaining about was that they couldn't get accurate records from the office.
It's hard to believe, isn't it?
It is.
You know, it's only a little more than 20 years since that time, and we have computers everywhere now.
That's
but
right.
back 20 years ago, they weren't everywhere.
That's right, and those records were just not that accessible. So we did some things in that area.
Well, you did such a good job at that a few years later you helped me out at my request when I was acting Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs.
Right.
You came in and your title had changed to Interim Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs and something else, Dean for Graduate Studies or something. But that was essentially the same job, and you did that for a year to help me out when I was in need of help.
Yeah, that was actually, things were actually much easier going back the second time, because there had been a lot more of an organization. Actually, the position was a little bit different from the one that I had in the first place, because it had actually, as you said, been moved into the Vice Chancellor's office, so it was not kind of a standalone dean position anymore. It was an Associate Vice Chancellorship and Dean for Graduate Studies. But it was much easier because, as I say, policies and procedures had been set up. The committees of the Graduate Council were working the way they were supposed to be working, and it was kind of a pleasure to be back for a little bit.
Yeah, well, after you helped me out in that job, you went back to the physics department for a couple of years, but then...
Well, no, actually, I went to the physics department after I left the graduate office the first time. I went back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, for a couple of years. But what happened after this position is that Ernie Peck came in as Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. And right after Ernie Peck came in, your successor, Jim Malik, who was only there for 9 months, left. And so Ernie and I had a discussion, and Ernie decided he needed me more over in arts and sciences than he did in...
So you became interim dean for...
so I became interim dean of arts and sciences for a year.
And then eventually you moved into the full-time job as dean.
I did.
Full-time as interim dean too, but I mean the full title.
Yes, right.
Well, tell us about the dean's job. I know about it, but our listening audience doesn't. Okay. What does a dean do? Well, especially the Dean of Arts and Sciences.
Yeah, I think the Dean of Arts and Sciences has probably the most challenging job of all.
I can agree with that.
Yeah, right, I'm sure you can. Well, at the time that you were Dean of Arts and Sciences, we had 15 different departments, very diverse departments in social sciences, natural sciences, and humanities. And so the job really is to make sure that these 15, and now we have 14 because computer science went to the new College of IS&T, basically to make sure that those departments run well and have the resources that they need, and also to oversee personnel actions for faculty members, faculty in the tenure pipeline who need to be reviewed for reappointment and promotion and tenure. So those are some of the main ongoing day-to-day kinds of activities, primarily budgetary and personnel. And then there are other initiatives.
Well, those two, budget and personnel, are particularly personnel, I think, are really important, because that determines what the faculty of the college is going to be like, and and far into the future, since many people stay around for a good number of years.
And that's exactly, in fact, probably the main reason that I decided I wanted to do this job, because going back to some of the things we were talking about earlier, a lot of people were hired back in 1969 and 70 and 71, right after we joined the system. And as you say, a lot of those people stayed around, myself included, and now that they're beginning to retire. And so we have the opportunity to actually think things over. The faculties of the various departments have an opportunity to decide whether they want to hire someone of the same sub-discipline or if there's some other area that they want to strengthen. It's also an opportunity to bring in some really fine people, and we've been doing that. We've been recruiting very aggressively. We've brought in a lot of people. We're going to be recruiting for 18 people this year, believe it or not.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a
a lot.
That's a lot of work for a department chairman and for the dean.
And for the dean, yes. But it's very gratifying if the search comes out well and you get somebody that you really want. And we've been able to hire in almost every case the first or second choice of the search committee,
Great.
which has been really wonderful.
Well, you mentioned just now that that it is gratifying when you're able to hire good people. What other rewards are there for the dean? You know, what makes the job worthwhile?
Oh, I think you know, just being able to meet the needs of the department's you know, equipment needs, computer needs, and so on. The department chairs pretty much look to the dean to try to come up with these things because their own operating budgets are not so large that they can use them to buy the things they need. So it's gratifying when you can, say, buy a $30,000 spectrophotometer for the chemistry department. And I enjoy the budgetary part of it very much, in spite of the fact that the resources are rather meager. It's a little challenging. It's kind of like a game, but it's gratifying when you can see that what you've done is actually resulting in some improvements in the department.
When you're able to give, to see that departments get the resources that they need in order to do their best work.
Absolutely.
Well, you know, you mentioned, you used as an example just now a spectrophotometer for chemistry, and that's something you're certainly familiar with. But you also mentioned that you've got 14 different departments. This, and they encompass a wide variety of disciplines.
They do. Mm-hmm.
Did you have to brush up your knowledge in all of these other departments? I mean, philosophy and foreign languages, and you know, all of the others that make up the college. Yeah,
to some extent, you certainly have to do that. You have to make yourself aware of what's going on in those areas, at least, and what the hot areas are, hot subdisciplinary areas, and so on. Of course, you can never learn all of it for 14 different departments, but that's one of the intriguing parts of the job too, is broadening your knowledge in these various areas and finding out exactly what's going on. And the other interesting thing is, as I'm sure you know, each department sort of has its own character. The Department of History operates in a totally different way from the Department of Mathematics, which operates in a totally different way from the Department of Foreign Languages and so on. And so part of the job, too, is becoming familiar with these departmental nuances and characteristics and working with the faculty in the various departments. And you really need to stay in touch very closely with the faculty in order to be able to be fair-handed about the way you distribute resources and decide who's going to get what, because their needs are totally different. And that's part of the intriguing part of the job.
Yeah, it's. I think that was what I always enjoyed most about it, was the variety that you got in, and you had a chance to learn a lot of new stuff.
Yes, absolutely do. Yeah.
Kept you on your toes.
It does.
Now, I remember at one time the professional organization for deans, what's it called, the Council of Colleges of Arts and Sciences or something. Right. They used to have a series called, you know, what's new in physics, or what's new in teaching foreign languages. Do they still have that? Do you know?
Not that I'm aware of. No.
That helped me a lot. Go to these and hear distinguished professors from different institutions talk about what's new in their discipline and what the hot areas are and where they're going, and that was I found that very helpful.
Speaking of that organization, one of the things that I did when I became dean was to go to a workshop for new deans. It's sponsored by CCAS back east, and that was very helpful because you go to a bunch of sessions that are actually chaired by people who have been deans for a while at various institutions around the country. And of course, every institution does things a little bit differently. They have their budgets distributed differently and so on. They have different problems and different solutions, but it is very interesting to be able to talk to these other deans who have been in the business for a while. And
among other things, you find out that you share a lot of problems.
Yes,
the world's a small place. Everybody has the same sorts of problems to work with, and it's interesting to see how different people handle them in different places.
Mm-hmm. It is. Yeah, that's one of the things that I always enjoyed about going to the Council on Colleges of Arts and Sciences is not only that you get a chance to sit in on sessions of current topics like strategic planning, which seems to be going on everywhere now, and legal issues and that sort of thing. But when you're not in the sessions, you get to talk to other deans and cry on each other's shoulders. And the thing you come back with is that no matter how bad you think things are here, you can always find somebody or someplace else where things are worse. Yeah. So it's kind of rejuvenating in a way.
Yeah. Well, you've been here, as we've mentioned earlier, for a number of years. 1969, it's a long time ago, 30 years ago. More than 30. In that time, I know that you've met and seen a number of different people at the university here. Some of them are strong and outstanding individuals. You mentioned Mabel L. I know you weren't here when he was here, but he's certainly one that everyone remembers if they were here when he was here, because he was a very strong person. But tell us about some of the other people. For example, maybe we could start with your department chairman when you came here, John McMillan. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us something about him, and then we'll go on and talk about anybody else you want to talk about.
Well, John had a Scottish background, as you would imagine from the name McMillan. And,
something you shared.
Something we share, right. And he pretty much acted that way. He was kind of a tough character. He could be a little brusque at times. And as I said, he took his job as a department head very seriously, and he was not as much of an autocrat as I might have let on before. He did, in fact, talk to us about things, but once he made his mind up, his mind was made up, and that was the way things were going to be, and so you lived with it, and it worked okay. I mean, we did our jobs, we taught our courses, and I managed to get my research done and so on. But he was really kind of a character. He was had a very brusque exterior, but he was kind of soft-hearted.
Yeah, I grew to have a lot of respect for him. Yeah. He was the department chair when I first became dean, and he was very helpful to me, and I think he appreciated what the needs of the department. Well, he must have, because he hired you, right?
Yes, he did, right? Yeah, no, I think he fought very hard for whatever he needed, whether it was additional faculty or equipment or whatever. He would really go to bat for you and fight very hard. And I remember at that time, the chairs of some of the other science departments, Don Marquardt was the chair of the chemistry department. And he was kind of a different sort of individual. He was a little bit more laid back, I think maybe a little more debonair than John McMillan was. But I think he did he did a very similar kind of job for the chemistry department as John did for physics. He was also a department head, and Paul Hader was the head of the mathematics department. All very fine people. I enjoyed my interactions with them. And also, I enjoyed, at that time, it was not uncommon for faculty members to go to the Student Center. We had a faculty lunchroom at that time. Mm-hmm. And so you'd get to meet a lot of faculty members from other departments. I think that's probably where I met people like Orv Menard from political science, who has since become a very close friend, and people like Dwayne Willard, and who was in philosophy and religion, Cliff Anderberg, and
And all of those people you've mentioned have been interviewed in this series by Paul Borghi some years ago. So anybody who remembers those and wants to see something of them, you can go to the library and sign out these tapes.
That's great. That's great.
And someday people will be signing out your tape.
How about that? Yeah, I think you know, it was. I think those people and people like Dave Scott are the people that I really learned.
Dave Scott now was chairman of political
science at the time, and then he eventually went over to the new College of Public Affairs and Community Service. But those were the people that I really learned a lot about the history of UNO and the way things work and that sort of thing. It was very instructive. I would certainly encourage any faculty member who's new to UNO to try to get to meet some of the older faculty members from other departments, especially since a lot of them are going to be retiring fairly soon. And
it's harder to do these days, isn't it?
It is really.
You mentioned the faculty lunchroom. I think that was a very good institution. Or there were tables in the student center where people would go over and join each other for coffee in the morning and this sort of thing, and you'd get people mixing from different departments, and not just different departments in the same college, but different departments in other colleges.
That's right, yeah. And I don't think that's done quite as much anymore. Yeah. I think there are obviously other ways in which word gets around in terms of people who might have common research interests, for example, and so on. So, in fact, I think the faculty indoctrination programs that we have at the beginning of every year are very helpful in that respect, because new faculty members all come together and go through these sessions, so they at least get to know who else is coming in that year, and I think that you know, eventually people who have similar interests do manage to get together, but it's not as easy as it used to be.
No, we're a bigger institution.
That's true, much bigger, right?
I remember, maybe you were involved with it back in the mid-'70s, but I remember one thing I did was to have kind of parties for faculty members, and I'd invite people who arrived on the scene at the same year.
Right.
And people would wonder why they were invited with all these other, what's the agenda here? And the agenda was quite simple. It was, if you were hired in 1968, it'd be kind of fun to meet the other people that were hired in '68. Maybe you met them once when you're during your your beginning orientation meetings, but get to see them again, and that was fun. I really enjoyed that.
That was fun. Yes, I remember that. I remember that.
Yeah.
I have had parties for faculty members who have come in together on occasion, just so that they would have an opportunity to meet each other. And generally, I've found that they've already met each other through the orientation session. But that is a good thing to do. And I think one of the things about UNO is that there is this kind of collegiality among the faculty. It's kind of like one big family. It's not a situation where people tend to think in terms of departmental silos, so to speak.
Yes.
And so I think that there is a lot more interest now in doing interdisciplinary kinds of projects and interdisciplinary teaching.
Well, I know a number of, I'm not involved anymore since I've retired, but I have noticed that we're doing these teaching circles now that involve people from where they talk about their teaching techniques and how to become a better teacher in the disciplines in which they're working, and that brings together people from different disciplines.
Yes, it does. Yeah, those are smaller groups. I think they're generally 5 or 6, and each group has some particular aspect of instruction that they sort of focus on and kind of report to the other groups, I guess maybe once a semester or once a year in terms of what they've been doing and so on. That is a really good institution. I hope we can keep that up.
Any other folks you can remember as strong characters on the UNO scene back in the early days or later days?
I think Bill Petrowski was a pretty strong character. Bill Petrowski?
Oh, yes. Professor William Petrowski of the History Department.
History Department, right. And Bill was, I guess, one might say from time to time a thorn in the side of the administration because he had a very strong interest in budgets. And
he was a fine economic historian.
He was very fine, yeah. And he was also a character that was a little bit difficult to get to know, kind of, well, somewhat haughty.
Kind of a curmudgeon.
Curmudgeon, that's a good word, right, yeah. But I remember he was president of the Faculty Senate a couple of times, and I remember working on, when I was on the Faculty Senate, we were working on things like faculty workloads and faculty salaries, trying to set up floors for various ranks. And,
we should mention, though, as long as we're talking about Bill, we should talk about his wife.
Shirley, yeah.
Shirley Petrowski, who you knew very well, and I knew very well because she was my secretary for many, many years.
Yes, that's right. And she was really a godsend for me coming into that office because Shirley knew just about everything there was to know about that office.
That's right. She knew everybody in the university and knew how to get things done.
That's right. She saved my bacon on more than one occasion. Because as you know, coming into that position, there are a lot of things to learn, and if you don't have somebody around to kind of direct you a little bit, you can really make some bad mistakes. So I really appreciated having Shirley there, and we were on friendly enough terms that if I was doing something that she didn't think was quite appropriate, she'd say, "Are you sure you really want to do that?" You know? And
she'd been around long enough so she could do that with some authority.
Right. Yep. Yeah, she was great.
I wish she were still living in Omaha because I'd love to interview her for this series.
Oh, that'll be wonderful. Maybe you can fly her back
right.
sometime. And Bill too.
Well, we're getting towards the end of our session here, and really do appreciate your taking the time to come in and talk with me this morning.
I enjoyed it.
It's been fun. We've been talking with Professor John Flocken, who's also Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at UNO. And for our audience, I'd like to thank you for joining us today in a visit with Dr. Flocken. He's been a longtime professor of physics and currently is Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, as we said. We've been taking a look at some of the history of UN Omaha as seen through the eyes of the history makers. This is Jack Newton inviting you to join us again in the series we call Reflections in Time.
Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.